Hello everybody, it's Paul Williams here. Those who have logged on to my webinars before should be familiar with myself. I'm the Wellbeing Lead of Police Federation of England and Wales, and I'm coming here with my colleague Richie.
Yeah, Rich Murray. I'm the Health and Safety Lead for the organisation currently. Doing a lot of work in getting the statistics and feed for suicides within our organisation.
And you'll notice we're joined by another colleague here. Tristan, would like to introduce you?
Yeah, I'm Tristan Hallam. I'm a partner at Bainton's, Manchester Cooper Solicitors, and I've done Federation work, personal injury Federation work since almost 30 years, since --
Thank you, Tristan. Just some housekeeping because we've got a lot to get through today. We want to get through this as we want to give you as much content as possible. And we've got guest speakers, including Tristan here, that have got a lot to say on this subject, an emotive subject. We want to make it powerful and snappy because we want to get a point across that's very poignant, but also it's very relevant to some of the problems we're having in policing nowadays in wellbeing. So there will be room for questions at the end. However, we can't take everybody's questions, but we will be showing a link very shortly, or QR code, that you can link it up and type in your questions, and we can deal with them after the event. This meeting is being recorded live, and it's also going to be placed out on our media channels. So if you've registered and you can't get onto the meeting for whatever reason, you can always play it back or go onto social media, YouTube, whatever, and this meeting will be out there. So as we are talking about an emotive subject, a very powerful subject of suicide. For that, we can't make apologies because we need to get this across if we want to keep saving lives. But please, if there's anyone on this call, anyone on this meeting that needs help, who is in crisis, the numbers are up on the screen now for the Samaritans, Thin Blue Line, and the Oscar Kilo Wellbeing Service that you can access through your branches. We also have the 24/7 police crisis line that's recently been opened and is now nationwide and available. So please use those services if you need to reach out, or similar, reach out to us personally if you'd like to, and if we can help, we will. If you have a question and you can't access the chat bar, please stick your hand up. If we can bring you in, we will. If we can, please understand and use the QR code, and we will get back to you. And again, feel free to pick up the phone and contact us for those who are allowed to do so at the end of it. We're going to go straight into the content we've got because we've got some really interesting, thought-provoking subject matter to come across, and this is going to be powerful, active stuff. That is the health one at the beginning. We have a guest speaker online at the moment, Paul Vittles, and I'll hand you straight over to Paul to introduce yourself, Paul, and let them know who you are, where you come from, and you can get straight into it, deliver your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to reflect on the work that I do in suicide prevention. I know there's so many people now working in this field, and it's always a privilege to be asked and to hear, to be able to give my perspective. I've, like my life and my family's life, have been touched by suicide in numerous ways over many years, and I've also worked professionally in suicide prevention for the past, since 2013, and I've worked with some major charities in the UK and overseas, and also worked on numerous collaborative projects, particularly trying to get systems change in this area. But I thought what might be useful in terms of reflecting here on World Suicide Prevention Day, with the theme of changing the narrative, is to just reflect on the fact that for each individual who gets exposed to suicide, it's a journey, and for each organisation as well, it's a journey. And a lot of people come into this tragically because they are exposed to a suicide. More and more, we're hoping to be proactive and to try and get more people and organisations discussing suicide, before they're exposed to a suicide death or a tragedy. But that's the reality. A lot of people come to it, for the first time for that reason. And a lot of people say that they know nothing about suicide. A lot of people who are bereaved by suicide say that they previously knew nothing about it at all, and it's a huge shock, and it's a huge learning curve. And they start to get the statistics, and they hear about 6,000 plus suicides for many, many years, and it actually went over 7,000 registered suicide deaths in the UK last year. And they hear about 200 school-aged children dying by suicide each year, and all these figures come at them. The biggest killer of men aged under 50, the biggest killer of men and women aged under 35. As all these statistics come at people, it's, my God, why did I never know this? And what can we do about it? So there's a lot of shock. There's a lot of people desperately trying to do something about it. And when you actually then start digging into statistics and look at the numbers of people who've been bereaved, who've experienced a suicide crisis and lived through it, have helped people, have witnessed a suicide attempt, you find that it's actually 70% of the population who've been exposed to suicide. So it's not a niche thing, but it's not 70% of the population are talking about it. And it's certainly not 70% of the population who are trying to do something about it. So this is our challenge. So that's the kind of personal journey that a lot of people go on, and they have a lot of fear about talking about suicide. So this is what a large part of the work we do is focused on, and a lot of the things you'll see today around World Suicide Prevention Day. How do we talk more about suicide? Because talking about it is a key part of the solution, and people fear about saying the wrong thing. And as I say, people go on this journey. They do a course. I noticed on BBC Breakfast this morning they featured the Zero Suicide Alliance online training, which is available free for anybody who wants to take that, to learn how to have a conversation about suicide. And there's plenty of guides around from Samaritans and other people. So, please, I would urge everybody to take that training, to read those guides, to have a conversation, and to know that you might fear getting things wrong. You might fear saying the wrong thing. But you just got to have a go, and you've got to learn it, and you've got to try. And the only way you learn is by having those conversations. And once you go on those courses, and some people may have been on those kinds of courses here, you learn about some of the do's and don'ts. You learn about asking direct questions, asking people, have you had thoughts of suicide? It's a tough question to ask, but it has to be asked. It's the only way that we actually find out if people are at risk or in crisis. And people fear putting the idea into people's heads. You hear these kind of comments all the time, but there's no evidence that you're going to make somebody who isn't suicidal by having a conversation about it. And there's plenty of evidence you're going to help people who are suicidal. So we want to encourage people to have those conversations. And so again, that's part of this journey that people go on. Once you get past that basic, what we often call awareness raising, and awareness raising is good, but it's not enough. You get into a deeper education and understanding of the problem. And a lot of the work that I do is going out, working with organizations and doing tours and events and conferences and helping people get a deeper understanding of what's going on. There's a lot of research has been done into the key drivers of suicides. It is a very complex matter. And in the programs that we do, we try and get across a few key messages, like, for example, we say suicide is not just a mental health problem. It's not just a mental health issue. And also suicide is even though it's officially called a cause of death, it's a means of death, not a cause of death. There are multiple causes, multiple underlying factors that are driving people into suicide crisis. And we see suicide as a problem, but people in crisis see suicide as the solution to their problem. And that's where we need to try and understand the mentality of people in suicide crisis and how to help them. The research is all out there. Lots of research has been done. It's not necessarily about having more research, and that's sometimes an excuse for not doing anything. But we know there is factors around financial factors, around relationship breakdown, around a whole bunch of loss experiences that people have, not just bereavement, but and other forms of traumatic loss, but all sorts of lost relationships when people have loss of a relationship, loss of access to children, loss of housing, all sorts of other issues that go on in lives, gambling, alcohol, etc., etc. It's a messy, complex set of factors that get people to a suicide crisis. So yes, there are people who become mentally ill and then will get into suicide crisis, but most people who die by suicide have no history of mental ill health. They can be fine one day, they can be in crisis the next. And it's it's important to have the conversations with people that are non-clinical conversations. We often assume that, people need to, they're not well, they need to go and see a doctor. But a lot of people in suicide crisis don't see themselves as being ill. They don't see themselves as needing health treatments. They don't see it as a health issue. They've got a financial issue or a relationship issue or some other form of issue. So we need to just keep becoming better educated, keep understanding these drivers, and keep understanding what we can do about it ourselves individually, our organisations, our communities, our professional associations, our governments. Everybody has a part to play in this, and everybody can help prevent suicides, just as anyone can be affected by suicide. Once you get into the conversations, you start to learn some of the subtleties in the language. Like sometimes people will say suicide doesn't discriminate, but it actually does, because there are certain groups that are more likely to die by suicide than others. But suicide can affect anyone is a true statement. And so we learn which of these kind of, statements are good messages to get out to people. And we've developed ways of bringing those messages out as conversation starters, but getting people to take them away with deep meaning so they can have conversations. And I'll come on to one of those. I've done a lot of research into what we can all do and what organisations can do. I did a big action research project with an organisation called the Jordan Legacy back in 2023, and we published a report called Moving Towards a Zero Suicide Society. And basically we looked at all the practical actions that we can take to get the numbers of suicides down, and we interviewed people working in charities, in academics, clinicians, campaigners, people with lived experience, and published that report in 2 years ago now. And I built a Zero Suicide Society transformation program around that, and a model that we can use in our education and training programs and in our ways of trying to get more action. And by focusing on that one question about what action can we take, what practical actions can we take to get the numbers down, it focused on that. So yes, we've got all the statistics, but sometimes we get lost in the statistics and people just keep asking for more data. But we don't always need more data to take more action. There's this kind of mentality in a lot of organisations and in government that we need more data, more research, more understanding, then we can do something. Well, the longer we keep doing all of that, the more people are dying by suicide. There was a report published this week about deaths in higher education, suicide deaths in higher education. And previously it had been thought that it was about 100 higher education students die by suicide each year. And the report published by ONS this week, looking at a 6-year period, shows that 160 deaths. And that caused people to say, oh my God, it's terrible, it's getting worse. Well, 100 was bad enough because there was 100 potentially preventable deaths. We just know it's 160. And the actions that need to be taken are no different this week as to what they were last week in terms of how we tackle that problem and how we try and prevent those deaths. And when we look at, I'll come back to a couple of other points in relation coming out of this report, and back to that issue about statistics as well. But in the model, in the transformation model that was built out of that research, it was a foundation stone of listening to people with experience, and that is where we're getting a lot of the ideas and a lot of the practical ideas on how to prevent suicides. Yes, there's still universities doing great research. Yes, there's still lots of work being done by lots of organisations, but it's increasingly being recognised that listening to and learning from people with lived experience of suicide, and by lived experience, that's people who've lost loved ones to suicide, who've cared for people through, supported people through a suicide crisis, people who have witnessed a suicide attempt, people who've had that exposure, and by virtue of their experience, they're kind of, if you like, experts in their experience. And by us listening to those people, we can see all sorts of practical things that can be done to reduce the numbers of suicides. And this is a relatively new thing. When I first started working in suicide prevention in 2013, it was very rare for people with lived experience of suicide to even be asked. The research would be carried out, and even to be asked for their views was rare. To be involved in the actual research project and design was almost unheard of, and there were no national kind of mechanisms for people to be involved. That has really boomed in the last 10 years, and it's now becoming recognised that that is the way to do it. So again, you can take your area of work, and you can say, okay, we could go away and do lots of research, and maybe you do need to do some research in some areas, but you can very quickly just engage with people who've got lived experience of suicide and say, what practical actions do you think will get the suicide numbers down? And you very quickly get an action list. It doesn't take very long. And then obviously you can ask other people to check that and verify that and check there's no harms in any of the actions being suggested. But it's not a long, complicated process, and we make it more complicated than it needs to be. So listening to people and learning from people's lived experience is the foundation stone for everything. And then we had two keystones in that model. One was continuous systemic action learning. When we looked at around the world at where suicide numbers are coming down, like famously at the Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, where they got the numbers down by 75% in 4 years, a lot of that was pretty basic systems within the organization to continuously learn and change something. It's not rocket science, but it hadn't been applied to suicide before. And when these things are applied to suicide, we get reductions in suicide. But if you look across your work environment, look around, even just look at inquests as well, there's often no systemic learning. There's a report published, but it doesn't go anywhere. Suspected suicides at work and uninvestigated by the health and safety executive. So a lot of basic systems don't exist. And within a single organization, you can say, okay, well, let's just learn from a suicide that we've had, or a suspected suicide, or somebody who's come through a crisis. What can we learn? What do we need to do to prevent that happening, or to better support people, and just have a continuous loop? It's no different to quality assurance or anything else that you might have as a basic system in your organization. And we've encouraged Parliament as well to have these kinds of systems, like, for example, to say, before any new law is introduced, before any new policy is introduced, before any major review recommendations come out, do a suicide prevention impact assessment. So again, these are basic things that we can all do. And then finally, there's another keystone, which is everyone must be a priority for someone. And this is a fundamental shift in our thinking. And this is where organizations are going on a journey. We've had in the past 12 months an intensive process with the overseen by the British Standards Institute to have an organisational standard for suicide prevention. And that's going to be published on the 19th of November this year. And we'll list a whole bunch of good practice around suicide prevention, intervention for people in crisis, post-prevention for people who've been affected by suicide, and the kind of organisational culture that will give you most chance of minimising the numbers of suicides. And we would encourage all organisations to align to that. But as part of that process, we went through all the evidence. We looked at views of people, lived experience, etc. And what you learn, again, this is what I mean by going on a journey, a personal journey, an organisational journey. What you learn is that you start to learn there are lots of practical things we can do, but there are a lot of barriers in the way. And one of the biggest barriers is that the way organisations tend to set themselves up and the way that governments tend to operate is that they say you've got to focus on priorities. So which group is going to be a priority? Where are you going to put your resources? And that's the way that most things are organised, right? That's our paradigm. But with regard to suicide prevention, you can't start saying, well, that person's more important than that person. You want to try and protect everybody. So it's very easy to fall in that trap of saying, well, who are the priority groups? Who should we look after? Well, surely we should be trying to protect everybody. And what's coming out from a lot of the work that's been done now and reviews in the NHS and so on is that one of the biggest problems over the past however long has been things like risk assessments, the way that people approach risk assessments. So in hospitals, people will present and they will be assessed, and they'll be assessed in terms of their risk of suicide, high risk, medium risk, low risk. And then the evidence shows that the people who are assessed as low risk are most likely to die by suicide, because the very fact of being assessed as low risk means they get less support. And the people who are assessed as high risk are less likely to die by suicide. Now, that's taken about 10 years to get those reviews going through the system to show how balmy that is. And when we were putting together the British standard, we were saying, well, we can identify all these priority risk groups, but that doesn't necessarily help a manager or a team leader in an organisation. What they need to know about is the risk situations, not which group is more likely to die by suicide as another, because otherwise you're going around the organisation trying to predict who's going to die or who's going to have a suicide crisis, which is a futile exercise and not something anybody would recommend. But if you look at those situations, it's somebody who's facing a life crisis, or they're going through a divorce, or they're going through a major kind of career change, or they're going through a disciplinary, or they're going through, all these situations become risk factors for suicide, and they're obvious places to give people support. Like if somebody's facing a traumatic loss experience, it's an obvious time to get the support around people to reduce their risk of suicide and to make it as early as possible as an intervention, and preferably as a prevention activity. And then, if you have this philosophy of everyone must be a priority for someone, you're always looking to focus on individuals. And it's a massive shift for organizations, because they will keep gravitating back to this. Well, there's only so much we can do. There's only so much resources. We have to set priorities. But suicide is something that challenges organizations, and I hope this challenges them in a good way. It's very easy for people to talk about well-being policies, and it's very easy for leaders to dismiss well-being policies as sounding a little bit fluffy, or the first thing to go in a cut, right? But suicide, we're literally talking about life or death. And there's more and more business cases coming through, and the cost, the financial impact on organizations, as well as the human cost, to make people think that we do need to actually invest in this and to embed these basic practices into our organizations. So get people through in basic training, get people learning about having conversations, encourage those conversations, asking the direct questions, continuous systemic action learning, get the systems in place, tell other organizations what support you need to actually do what you can do to get those numbers of suicides down, and just, keep involving people with lived experience, keep listening and learning. And in a space of time, you go from virtually zero knowledge for a lot of people to being pretty well informed about the issues, and then you shift into another phase, which is more about overcoming barriers to change and how you can overcome those barriers. And then it becomes like a transformational change challenge, but one which I feel we can rise to. And that's probably enough from me. So thank you again for the opportunity to share some of those reflections.
Thank you, Paul. You've said some really interesting phrases, comments and thoughts there that are really thought-provoking, and you can relate to some of them, because when you talk about lived experience, I've got lived experience of a police officer of 25 years, but I've also got lived experience of a Fed rep for over 10 years, as is my colleague, and other officers on this call will have that same experience. And we do sometimes get frustrated as police officers being told your opinion doesn't count because you're not a medical professional. And when you have that lived experience, I can quite confidently say, when I'm sat in front of somebody who is in crisis, which I very recently have, I know I can confidently tell them that they are in crisis, and I can confidently tell another agency they are in crisis, because I know the symptoms, I've seen the symptoms. But also touching on that risk assessment that you mentioned before, low, medium, high. Now, when me and you had a conversation offline a few weeks ago about this, when you mentioned that stuck with me, and you've mentioned it again. I'm glad you did, because risk is risk. When you're at risk of suicide, you're at risk of suicide. And you mentioned when someone said they're at low risk, they kind of fall off the edge, if you will, for want of a better term, because they're not getting that care and support that somebody at high risk would do. So my question would have been, well, after thinking about this comment, is, well, what the hell is medium risk? Well, where is someone sat in medium risk? Is this is this the person sat between two stools, you know, who's not getting anything, who's getting something and all in one area and nothing in another? So this is really thought-provoking stuff. When you mention organisations and the stuff we do around organisations and trying to get organisations to learn and to think a different way, to risk assess, to sometimes admit when they need to improve and where they don't. And that's the hardest thing for me as a Fed rep, because I'm sad to say that I feel like sometimes I'm banging my head against a brick wall trying to influence policies and trying to have some kind of influence on better practice, where some forces are very good in the wellbeing, some forces focus on this quite well. A lot of forces aren't. A lot of forces are pushing this to one side. A lot of forces are not taking this seriously. And with the misconduct process that we have, because we know, we have the stats and we know that officers under misconduct, more officers that are under misconduct process are taking their own lives because the process is flawed. The process is not fit for purpose when it comes to personal care of the human beings that are subject to that process. And a good colleague of mine just before this meeting did make a point. The criminals we deal with get better treatment when they're in crisis than the officers themselves by their own organisation. And that cannot be acceptable. And what we are campaigning for as PFEW is to not just put this in professional practice, not just put this into policy, as we've touched on, but to mandate, to tell forces they are legally obliged to actually do something about this, to risk assess, to care, to take responsibility, because you've used the term, this is a matter of life and death. Absolutely is. You know, you've made some very impactful statements here, and you could, on each of those statements you made, could break down and probably talk for a day and still not cover.
Sure. Yeah.
It's go on. I'll let you pop in there, Paul.
Yeah, just a quick response on that. The organisations obviously still need to do risk assessments of their organisation, but you don't assess individual risk. That's the point. Each individual, if they are any kind of risk whatsoever, should have a personalised safety plan with the things that can help keep that person alive, help keep that person, get that person through a situation. It's over reliance on perceptions of what risk assessment is, and also, you know, this obsession with priorities. It's so dangerous, you know. So we often get people say, oh, you know, men are at higher risk of suicide than women, so should we be prioritising men? Well, surely you want to keep women alive as well, don't you? You want to protect women, and you want to reduce the number of suicides amongst men and women. And as it happens, women are more likely to attempt suicide than men. It's just that men are more likely to die by suicide than women because they're more likely to use lethal means. So it's focusing on individuals. Yes, the organisation can assess risk. The organisation needs its learning systems. But at the end of the day, you have to focus on individuals because you're trying to protect and support each individual. And we find also, two brief other points. Once you start listening very carefully to people with lived experience, people who've been through crises, they will correct your language in a very challenging and constructive way. Like, for instance, I might say to somebody who's going through a disciplinary situation or feel as if they've had a perceived injustice in the way they've been treated at work and say, you know, were you thinking of ending your life? And they say, no, I felt my life had been ended, actually. Right? So it immediately makes you think about the situation differently. That's not somebody who's ill, who's wanting to end their life. That somebody feels that somebody else or their organisation has threatened their life, and they're looking for ways out of that situation. It's a very different way of seeing the world. So yeah, it's a continuous learning process, but it's one that I think is a really constructive, positive process, because if you view what you do at work through a suicide prevention lens, you tend to see things differently to the way that you see problems normally. We even get MPs who normally would not even consider a lot of these issues at all, who normally get polarised, looking through a suicide prevention lens together, because there's a common understanding of the problem and a common commitment to trying to solve the problem. But obviously there's a huge long way to go on this.
Yeah, Paul, thank you for that input. Just a question that I have. You harp on and we talk about learning from it. How can we learn if forces don't record? So they don't have that data, they don't record, and the data we hold, we ask the forces for. Some of our major big forces won't even tell us. So the biggest force in the country won't even let that information come out. So how can the individual forces learn if they don't record, don't investigate, and have that stance on it? It's a really difficult one, and it's a journey we're in the process of trying to change.
Yeah, in the British Standard BS 30480, which is being published in November, there's a list of questions in one of the annexes, which is the kind of questions that all organisations need to be asking themselves regularly. And I think there's stuff in there about data collection. There's certainly questions about what support systems do you have in place for X, Y, Z, all these key risk factors. Keep asking those questions as an organisation. Keep tackling the gaps, and you will get there. That's again, this is not rocket science.
I mean, a part of it is what we've looked at is the RIDOR question, and at the minute it says it has to be an accident, and forces are reluctant to even get involved because it's not. They'll say it's not an accident; it's an incident that's happened.
Yep.
So, and it's an avenue to look at as well.
Yeah, and bear in mind that the World Health Organization never looked at suicide until 2015, because it said its remit was to look at disease, and suicide wasn't a disease. So, even the World Health Organization has only recently come to the party. This is the journey we're all on, and we need organizations and at least one sort of pioneer in each sector who says we're going to commit to this, because of the human tragedy, but also because of the business case for it. The economic cost of suicide, the devastating impact even one suicide can have on performance and productivity, morale and attendance levels and so on. So, it only takes one force or one construction company or whatever to get into this. And I think that they'll reap the benefits. And again, we're encouraging through the British Standard process for, at least one, early adopter per sector or per profession to prove what we can do, and to look at any further data collection that we need, but not use it as an excuse. You can take action in the meantime. You can say, look, we're going to do some more research to plug these gaps, but we're going to be taking the actions, and we're not going to stop and wait, because that could be more lost lives while we're doing the research.
Absolutely, Paul, and obviously, when you say they're taking the actions, that brings us very nicely onto our next guest. Tristan here sat next to me, but just we were going to take a break for a few minutes, but I think we're running slightly over time. If you're happy, I'd like to keep the pace flowing, keep the foot on the pedal, and go straight into Tristan's input, if that's okay. But thanks very much, Paul. Very interesting input there. And sat next to me, Tristan Hallam, who I've used a number of times during me work in the Federation. Very good colleague, very knowledgeable in the subject matter that he covers. Has provided very recent assistance to me also, that's been invaluable. And to cover specific subject matter around action we can take as Fed reps when supporting families and colleagues who've been impacted by this stuff, certainly when it's duty related. Tristan, without further delay.
Paul, thank you. I was asked to look into the issue of suicides and duty related suicides a wee while ago by National Federation. And when I first thought about it, first of all, I have, as I said before, done personal injury work for the Federation for some years, but have never in the past been asked to look at the risk of suicide and whether suicides have been increasing as a result of actions that have been taken by the force. And you are always going to have situations. I know this is an obvious point, but I'll say it anyway. You're always going to have situations where officers, as Paul has said earlier, where officers are faced with personal situations, and used examples which I know are common to many people: divorce, separation, house issues, job issues, drug issues, money issues, whatever they might be, where those situations cause that person to take their own life. That has to be separated from situations where officers are put in a work situation where the actions of the force have materially, and I use my words, choose my words carefully, as some of you who know me know well, the actions of the force materially contribute to the officer's decision to take their own life. And that's essentially what I have been asked to look at. In other words, have there been situations over the last few years which mean that officers have taken their own lives in circumstances where they would not otherwise have done, in all likelihood, as a result of actions taken by the force, which has meant in turn that the number of officers who have taken their life due to duty-related reasons, specifically as a result of conduct, criminal issues, has increased. And Richie showed me some stats this morning. And unfortunately, for the reasons that Paul indicated before, we haven't got the opportunity to look at stats that have happened over the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years. There will no doubt be stats indicating that officers have taken their own lives, because people do. That's just the nature of the world that we live in. But in relation to officers taking their own lives with as a result of duty-related criminal and misconduct issues, just to quote these stats, if I may, over the last 3 years, that's between 2022 and 2024, 56 officers have taken their own life. Out of those 56, 43 were duty-related, and specifically, breaking it down even in a more defined way, 34 of those officers took their own lives as a result of criminal investigations. That's those officers who have actually taken their own lives, and that's and I'll use this word, I'm sure, on multiple occasions. It is utterly tragic. And to go back to Paul's point, and also to I know the point is obvious, but I'll make it anyway. It's the impact that is not just on, of course, an officer taking his or her own life and losing their life in these circumstances, but the impact of those around them, the family, for example, is massive. And the impact going forward, therefore, has to be massive. And in the 3 cases, and I only have 3 for the moment, and I have no doubt that others may follow later, but of the 3 cases I'm dealing with at the moment, where I have 2 male officers who have taken their own life, 1 female officer hung herself at home, and her son was 15 at the time. Of the 2 male officers who took their own lives, 1 left 2 young daughters, and the other left a daughter who was only a few weeks old. All of which will be significant impact on the family going forward, no doubt for the rest of their lives. I doubt whether children who are certainly in their teens, or indeed anyone, or indeed partners or spouses, fully recover from that type of situation. And therefore, if there is an increase in the number of officers who are taking their own lives for a specific reason that is materially contributing to that officer taking that decision, this must be looked at now. There's absolutely no question about that. I know that's a given point. I've mentioned those officers who actually took their own lives. The stats, what will come as no surprise to you, for those officers who have attempted to take their own lives and weren't then successful, are also, of course, high. 120 officers during the same period, between 2022 and 2024, that 3-year period, attempted to take their own life, and obviously in those circumstances were not, fortunately they were not successful. Of which 104 were duty-related, and of which 71 were subject to criminal or misconduct procedures at that particular time. Gaz, plans for the next slide, please. From my perspective, looking at it from a personal injury perspective, and having done Federation work for as many years as I have done, I have seen a significant increase in pressure on officers. And that is due to multiple reasons. And I'm sure this is a contributor, in my view, to officers taking the decisions that they have done. And I take the view that because of the pressure that officers are under, some officers will, of course, go off sick with stress, and that means that they are leaving colleagues who have to do their work as well, who are then under a great amount of pressure. There's no massive pot of money being thrown at police forces. In fact, invariably, year on, year out, it doesn't matter which government it is, the budget for police forces is invariably reduced. And that in itself has meant there's been a significant increase in pressure. And certainly from my perspective, I've noticed a significant increase in a number of personal injury cases where I'm being asked to advise, where officers have sustained a psychiatric injury in work-related reasons. As far as the pressure on officers is concerned, Gav, can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to jump a wee bit if I can. This in itself has caused a massive amount of pressure. You know, Carrick and Cousins should never have happened. It did happen, probably because many people, no doubt from significantly higher ranks, simply took their eye off the ball. But the impact of Carrick and Cousins and the public reaction to what happened has in itself been significant. I'm seeing lots of questions or points coming in. I'm sure we can answer those if we can at the end. But the impact again of Carrick and Cousins and what happened in relation to them both has been significant. It's impacted on every officer up and down the country because forces have viewed things differently. And it's right to say they should have done this. This is absolutely stable door, horse bolted. This should have been looked at years ago. In relation to Carrick, the warning signs were already there. Hertfordshire and the Met have absolutely failed. The fact that the Met, sorry, I do have a tendency to rant on occasions, and apologies if I do, but the Met is now out of special measures. That in itself is absolutely staggering. Sorry, before I rant further, Gal, can I have the next slide, please? And this, in my view, has been the impact of Carrick and Cousins. So that now when officers are looked at for disciplinary proceedings, even for the most minor point, they are charged with gross misconduct. And I saw an officer who tragically lost a colleague last year when he took his own life. They've both been charged with gross misconduct for no good reasons at all. He had come to see her when they were both served with the Rec 17 papers. And the words he said to her were exactly what I said to her when I met her, that every officer knows what being charged with gross misconduct means. It means, first of all, that you're very likely to lose your job, potentially that you may go to jail, and there's also a risk of losing your pension. It's the change in life that Paul has said before in the earlier talk. The impact of being charged with gross misconduct is going to change your life. And as one widow said to me when her husband was charged with gross misconduct, because he'd already had a colleague who'd been through the same, this is going to take years. I'm likely to be suspended. In all likelihood, I will lose my job. In all likelihood, we will have to sell the house. How are we going to pay the mortgage? You know, how are we going to put bread on the table for the kids? The impact is significant. And from my perspective, looking outside in, forces simply do not realise the impact it has on officers. They simply say, Carrick and Cousins happened, and therefore we have to charge every single officer with gross misconduct because that's what people are expecting us to do. From my perspective, when I'm looking at whether I can bring a claim against the force as a result of charging the officer with gross misconduct, and that's essentially what I'm doing, I'm being asked by national and by branches to support widows and partners and families where officers have taken their own lives. And I've been asked to consider to what extent there is criticism on the part of the force. The common thread out of all the three families that I'm assisting at the moment is, in each case, the officer was charged with gross misconduct before they took their own life. In my view, although I'm not a criminal and discipline lawyer, but I have spoken to those who are, and in the Federation, the allegations raised against them need not have been dealt with as a gross misconduct. And therefore, the obvious question, or the obvious point rather, if they had not been charged with gross misconduct, because they needn't have been at the time, in all likelihood, they would still be alive now. And that is tragic. That really is. Next slide, please. Thank you. I have to look at it from this perspective, and I do try and be objective, although it's a subject which, in akin to the abuse work that I also do, where officers have been abused by others, I take a very subjective view, I'm afraid. You can't avoid doing so in these circumstances. But this is what you have to look at. From my perspective, I have to say, well, was there a duty of care? Well, there is a duty of care, because every force owes every single officer a duty of care. The important point from my perspective, which I haven't yet established, and I'll come on to the litigation that's going through at the moment, because there is a case that's going through the High Court at the moment, for an officer who took his own life and where he left a wife and 2 young girls, and we just issued and served court proceedings. And we have someone called Sarah Crowther, KC, who's out of Temple Chambers on papers. When it comes a surprise to any of you that the force, of course, haven't said that they are culpable. I can't expand on that, but the point is obvious. But I have to establish a breach of duty of care. That's a relatively high hurdle. These are cases that are not guaranteed to succeed. The steps most certainly should be taken. And National are supporting all of this for very good reasons. But again, without wishing to bore you all, these are if the suicide stats are increasing in the way they appear to be, this has to come to a stop very soon. And that has to be a multi-pronged approach, not only from branch level in supporting the officer, and not only going through and putting pressure on the forces to carry out the steps that were mentioned earlier on, but also from a national level as well, and also from a legal perspective. Forces have to realise that if they are putting themselves in a position where they are ignoring the health and the well-being of officers who are potentially at risk of suicide, that we will take legal action against them. I tend to think it's really important that we as lawyers get involved as early as we possibly can, and there's good reason for that. The inquest, which invariably is held, is vitally important. If the coroner, who has a very limited scope, and I'm sure you all know this, but I'll bore you by going through the points anyway. The coroner has a very limited scope. The coroner invariably will say, all I can do as far as the inquest is concerned is say who died, how, in what circumstances, and where. So we have to try and convince the coroner that there's much more to the inquest than necessarily meets the eye. And the approach that I will invariably take with inquests is to say to the coroner at the earliest possible opportunity that this should be approached as an Article 2 inquest. That's Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, which provides right for life. And that if the coroner accepts that the inquest should be dealt as an Article 2 inquest, enables the coroner then to have a much wider scope as far as criticism is concerned. I also take the view that if we are approaching the inquest in that way, that we should say to the coroner, these are the circumstances that in which the officer took his or her own life. There were gross misconduct proceedings being brought at that time. As far as we're concerned, they should never have been taken in these circumstances. And therefore, as far as we're concerned, you should bring in the chief constable, whichever force it might be, as an interested party, as an IP. The interested party, the chief constable, then has to take an interest in the inquest. They are then served with papers. They are brought in to the inquest, and no doubt there are parties within the force which will have to give written or oral evidence before the coroner. It's really important. So essentially what we're asking the coroner to do is to say to the force, explain yourself. Why did you serve this officer with Regulation 17 gross misconduct papers in these circumstances? And in particular, what impact that this is likely to have had on the officer? It's really interesting, again, the point that was made earlier is that not every person who takes their own life has previous psychiatric issues. And in fact, I think the stats probably show, if I'm right, and if my memory serves me, that more people who take their own life don't have previous psychiatric episodes. So you have to say that what was the cause? Why did that officer take his or her own life? And in those circumstances, the only possible reason could have been the service of the gross misconduct papers. And in circumstances where they were given no support, they were simply served with the papers, and that's it. It also, if the coroner is minded to do, and I've had one situation where, in fact, it's the case where we have the papers in the High Court at the moment, the coroner issued a prevention of future death notice, and that should be pressed for as well. We should be saying to the coroner, you coroner should be considering issuing such a notice, which goes against the force to explain again why they acted in the way that they did. And again, it goes to my multi-pronged suggested approach, that if we push on that basis, chief constable, of course, speak to each other, and one would hope that it will finally filter through, and that there's an impact on the forces, a negative impact for lots of different reasons, not just financial, in failing in their duty to the officer, in not taking appropriate steps to make sure that the officer was supported, such that had they been supported, invariably they would not have taken their own life. Yeah, thank you. PSD ACU, I know everyone knows what that means, Professional Standards Department, Anti-Corruption Units. Absolutely should be held to account, because invariably they're serving the Reg 17 notices. And the case that I have where he left behind a young baby, literally born no more than weeks before he took his own life, it's just tragic. The way that those two units acted, it's inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. And I just wanted to raise that just as a matter of note. And again, I have no hesitation in criticising both units if I have to. Hindsight, I think. I have been, from outside looking in, been saying to people for many years, it can't get any worse, surely. People are under so much pressure, there's been so many cuts, police stations have been closed, the public doesn't even know the half of it. You know, officers who are on single crewed on response, where they're covering a massive area because they're not turning out the required number, resourcing requirement that they should do for that particular area, and the pressure that has on officers who are going from job to job to job has been massive over the years. It's just got increasingly worse. I am really concerned that officers taking their own lives is a symptom of where policing is at the moment. And if that is the case, then, you know, it's just horrendous. So without wishing to become too emotive, things need to be done now if the stats are going in that direction. And the clear indication at the moment is that that is the case. But it must be a multi-pronged approach, in my view. It's down to forces, it's down to branches, it's down to national, it's down to us as lawyers as well, to do as much as we possibly can.
Thank you, Tristan. That's really powerful stuff, and that's how we want it. We need that message to come across, because we need the impact, and there's nothing greater than having the impact of a legal process, a legal viewpoint, and High Court measures and coroner's Article 2 inquest. And we know there's been an increase in Reg 28 notices, because I've read regular meetings with Andy Rhodes from Oscar Kilo, who attends those and gives evidence. And I'm sure he'll say himself that that's not a joyous process. And there are steps in the background to hopefully try and improve this, but our push is to get that mandation through. And we've got a little bit of time left for questions. And I know, Belinda, your hand came up twice during that. Would you like to come in and just ask a question, please?
Yeah, there was someone before me, so I don't want to spoil them being able to come and ask a question. The only thing for me, and Tristan knows, obviously I've been working with you guys in the background since 2018 around, it was a passion of mine when I came in onto the national board. But interestingly, about the prevention of future deaths, what we're finding as well is it's all well and good a coroner putting a PFD on a force after an officer has sadly died by suicide, but actually who follows up on that? And I think for us as a federation, there's a lot more work to be done around that. It's about, you know, is there an action plan? Is there recommendations that the force have to go back and say we've implemented this, etc. So I think there's a lot more work that we can be doing as a federation in that, and also you know, the work that the things that Paul said earlier on about the risk assessment and misconduct work. We have created some guidance that we need to push out to say, and maybe probably relook at it actually. And actually, I feel the only research we need to be doing now, and I know someone did do this a couple of years ago, is actually do some really sensitive research around and speak and reach out to the families and the loved ones of those officers that we have lost, that are willing to talk to us, that we can get a real overview of what it was like to be living with that person, and actually what their thoughts are around why their loved one felt that was the only way out. So I think there's a lot of learning that we can take away from this session. It's been a great session, and thank you, Tristan and Paul, for coming in and talking to us today. So I'll shut up there. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Bea. Always relevant in what you say. The work continues. Was it Kerry? Did you have your hand up? Hi, Kerry, are you with us? Again, put your hand up. Oh, here we are.
Got James as well. James has put their hand up. Oh, Kerry's come back in.
Hi, Kerry, if you're there, can you? Here we are. You're on mute at the moment.
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, it was disabled, so I couldn't unmute myself. I think it was just the question. Well, I put a few things in the chat, but was around. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on, but I think you mentioned it right at the start to say that you just kind of almost banging your head against a brick wall consistently. I've raised this numerous times, and basically the answer was, just make sure you look after yourself then. And I was like, yeah, that kind of wasn't the answer. Do you think this additional work that you're doing will start to make a difference?
I think it will, Kerry. You do raise a good point. I do like your comment there, because I've heard that one countless times before. But yes, I think it will, because this has to take priority. Wellbeing has to be a government priority now for policing, because they've got no money. If they want to improve attrition rates and improve the quality and the well-being of cops, then we've got to start listening to those who are raising the issues. It can't be avoided when the cops are dying in front of you. It can't be avoided when we've got this, for example, the Channel 4 documentary highlighting the real problems. And it can't be avoided that our push is to get directly into government and try and influence some kind of mandation to get this dealt with, and the misconduct as well is part of that process. So as we've said before a number of times, multi-pronged. But Kerry, yes, I would like to think that this would have an impact. Do I think it's going to be an overnight thing? Absolutely not. I think there's a lot of work for us to do. But if we all huddle in and work together, we'll have a greater impact. So thanks, Kerry. Who's next, Jenny? You're on mute,
Hi,
Jenny.
sorry, thank you. I couldn't get myself off mute for a minute there. Yeah, I really just wanted to add to what's been said about the fact that it's not really if any children involved in these sort of situations are going to be affected. It's a case of they are. There's so much research now around adverse childhood experiences, and I don't think that's ever really taken into consideration.
That's a good point, actually. It's a very complex area, isn't it? And I think because we're all in a rush and in a hurry and wanting to go from one subject matter to the next, sometimes to sit down and break down the nuts and bolts of something to get down to the whys and wherefores and how we do it, then that's quite relevant when it comes to that. Denise.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Denise. How are you?
Hello. Yeah, I'd just like to say, as a serving officer in the Met, I don't actually think that there's an appetite at a senior level to actually address these issues. I think, you know, they've been highlighted multiple times, and yet they've not even implemented simple measures that have been raised out of various reviews, like the Casey review and things like that, stuff that's designed to support officers. And then on top of that, their answer to that is to remove the wellbeing teams across the Met. So that peer-to-peer support, that non-clinical conversation that you can have, that is actually probably more beneficial to some than the clinical support that's available. And they've removed that, and they've put additional pressure additional pressures on officers to volunteer as wellbeing officers to fill that gap, on top of unmanageable, unrealistic workloads. And
absolutely, sorry.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
they just see, it's like they just don't care. You're just a number. And they don't. Yes,
yeah. Sorry, Denise. That what you say there, I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with you on that one. Do we think they're doing enough? Absolutely not. Do we think they're taking this seriously? No, absolutely not. And as far as taking down wellbeing hubs, certainly in the Met, where it's probably most needed right now, given the public disorder, I think is pretty narrow-minded and short-sighted. And I am going on public record and saying this. So
I'd just like to say on that as well, I think there's a real issue around where officers are raising the issue and trying to address it at a lower level by having conversations that they're almost gaslit and being made to feel like they're overreacting.
Yeah, Denise, just on the back, when I give earlier on said, when we asked for all the statistics and figures, the figures you've heard today, and Tristan's repeated them, doesn't include the Met because it's too hard to do. It's our response from them.
Yeah, so there's a lack of data that they could easily collate, but it appears that they don't want to.
Because you can imagine it, that this is for the rest of the force, and there's two big forces that haven't. This is statistics, what we have, it's going to be higher than this. And this is all only collated by federations, what they know. So this is just a starting point. It's going to be higher than we have. It's going to be way higher. And it's tragic that the fact that if we can't learn from something, and if you don't have those numbers, you can't, how are you ever going to learn?
It comes across as they're only interested in stuff that can give them quick wins, that they can say, look how amazing I am, look what I've done to transform the organisation. But anything that actually requires some looking in the mirror and looking at what the real problem is, it's like they're constantly trying to put a plaster on a catastrophic bleed and expecting it to stop. And, you know, they need to just rip that off and actually deal with the real issue.
Absolutely right there.
Thank you.
We are running out of time, are we? Jason, should we bring Jason in? Hi, Jason.
Hi there, how are you?
Thanks, mate.
Just briefly, I was sort of response 20 years and CT for 5 years, but now the wellbeing skipper. I'm surprised always that, as I understand it, the Police Act 97 make cops employees for the purposes of health and safety legislation. And under that, you've got the management standards and the pillars of that, of which we constantly seem to be in breach of it. But I'd never see any challenge or rectification around that. It seems like there's a legal basis for challenge, but I never see anyone pushing that, if you like. So either I'm misinterpreting the legislation or we're not. I just wonder if there was a view on that.
Can I just jump in? Unfortunately, although the 97 Act did bring in the early 1992 and 98 regulations, the health and safety work regulations, Section 69 of the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act did away with all those regulations. So we can't rely upon the health and safety work regulations that came out of Europe. And I won't say which government was responsible for that. But in any event, what we have to rely upon is much older regulations when it comes to legal challenges. But we have to also rely upon what's called foreseeability and common law arguments, which is exactly what we do here, and say, look, it's obvious that this is an issue here. And it's obvious, certainly in the case of, and I'll go back to the suicide point, the inquest, Article 2 and prevention of future deaths. That's exactly what we need to be able to say to the force. It's obvious that there was an issue, otherwise the coroner would not have issued a prevention of future deaths notice.
And officers forces do have a duty to train and responsibility. And a lot of these work that we find when people are under misconduct, they've not been trained in the relevant thing, yet they find themselves under misconduct because of it. So,
how are we doing for time? Yeah. Unfortunately, we're out of time for when I've actually gone over. But I can see a lot of questions in sidebar. Please use the QR code to ask those questions or make those statements, because all your feedback is very important. Because we need to know as a national federation that we're on the right track for a subject matter to be pushing in the best members, in the members' best interest. And if there's any suggestions of any further action we can do. We've got Spencer Raggett from Hampshire, is it?
yeah,
The chair of Hampshire. He's running a step campaign as well around suicide. He's doing some great work around that, campaigning around the country. He's in touch with us regularly. So well done, Spencer. As a quick mention, keep up the good work and please join in, anyone who feels the need to. But don't hesitate to reach out, ask the questions. This is a powerful subject. It's not nice to talk about, but the more we talk about it, the more impact we're going to have. So thanks very much, everybody. Please provide the feedback if you can. It's really important to us. And please look after yourselves. It's National Suicide Prevention Week. So please look after yourselves and each other and reach out if you need to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.